like to drive around and talk about the latest happenings. This is the channel you need, so subscribe and follow Carmentary.
What's up, everybody? Good evening and welcome to Carmentary. My name is Neil and I'm going to talk about stuff while driving in my car. Tonight I want to talk about snowboard design and specifically powder boards. Specifically Japanese powder boards like Genten, Snow Stick, and Moss, I guess, could be thrown in there. Ogasaka, Field Earth. There are a lot of Japanese snowboard brands that make really interesting, uniquely shaped powder boards. And I had a question. This came through my Instagram. Question was, this is someone I had talked to and advised some stuff about buying a Genten board. He bought a Fly Fisk. The board we're talking about tonight, we're going to start with talking about, is the Fly Fisk, which is a board in the lineup of Genten Snow Stick. It is their stiffest, widest board in the lineup. It was co-created, I guess you could say, with the Norwegian rider Mads Jonsson, I believe is how you say his name. One of the all-time great snowboarders for sure. I actually was lucky enough to shoot him doing the world record longest snowboard jump in Norway. That's, how many years ago was that? It's over 10 years probably. A great guy, an amazing rider. And he co-collaborated with Genten to create this Fly Fisk board. I have the split board version of it. I do not have the normal version of it, but I have the split board, so I know what it feels like riding it as a split board. My buddy Jimmy has the Fly Fisk board. He's goofy and I'm regular, so I never thought to borrow it from him for a run and test it out because riding it goofy ain't my style. Anyway, that is the board we're talking about tonight. Now the situation is, the fellow who sent me the question said he was riding it in powder in Myoko, which is in Niigata Prefecture here in Japan, and I guess I'm assuming some deep powder, and he had some issues with it submarining, and that probably led to some front flipping, which is not what you want to do in powder. So he's like, what's going on? What is my setting wrong? What's the situation? There's a lot of variables here, and this is a different one to just say this is what's causing your submarining problem. But I had a little think on it, and what we have to understand here is the main variables being the snow quality at the time. Japan has a range of snow. Well, everywhere has a range of snow. In general, I would expect the Myoko area snow to be a heavier, thicker kind of powder than what you might find in some areas more north in Tohoku or Hokkaido. For example, central Hokkaido, you get a really light, dry powder. So light and dry you can sink through and be riding the crusty ice underneath, even though it's like 50 centimeters deep. I've had that happen. So the type of snow is going to affect how your board floats. The second variable, and probably the most important one, is going to be the stiffness of the board, regardless of the shape. I think that's a key that people kind of forget. They think powder board means like wide and long. But the key ingredient is going to be like the stiffness. You could take pretty short, a lot of like Ride, the brand Ride makes like the War Pig. I see a lot of people ride that board in Hokkaido. It's generally a shorter board. It's quite wide though, but it's rather soft in flex. So people seem to have a great time on it in the powder because of that fact. If that was really stiff, it would sink and submarine and you'd be flipping over a lot. Or you'd have to like set your bindings back and you'd have to force the tail into the snow, bring up the nose, and to be able to continue riding. So it's really, a key ingredient is to really think about the flex, then the quality of snow you're riding, and the third ingredient is going to be the pitch that you're riding on. This is a key factor. And depending on the percentage of those, it's going to change the results. So it's a tricky one. The steeper the slope, the stiffer the board you can ride. The steeper the slope, the shorter the board you can ride. The steeper the slope, the more forgiving it is to board design in general. And this is a key as to why we have the boards we have in Japan. We have a lot of low angle powder. We do not have the steepest mountains in the world. If you want steep, you go to Alaska, you go to the Alps, you go to Canada, you go to wherever. You're going to get steep. And steep and deep means like you can literally ride anything. Because the whole, the process is so different. When you're on a steep slope, you have to drop speed. You have to keep slowing down, right? You need to put the board sideways. You put the board sideways, you scrape snow off the mountain, you slow down, you control your speed, you go to the other side, you repeat that on down the mountain. On really steep slopes, it's very hard to do like these beautiful wide arcing curves, like soul surfing, snow surfing style, because you're just gaining too much speed too fast. So that I think is a factor that people forget. And that is why board design back in the days, in the 80s and the 90s, as board designs progressed and most of the industry was being led by, Burton and all these big brands, they were designing boards that worked on the steeper and generally probably more hard-packed slopes that they were riding in North America and in Europe. Here in Japan, we have the need to keep our speed. We have to keep our speed. We don't want to drop speed, because if you do, you're going to stop. And then you're going to be walking through powder to get to somewhere where it's steep again and you can put your bindings on and go down. You need to keep that flow. And that is such an integral part of the snowboarding style in Japan. And that led to brands like Field Earth and Genten and Moss and all these. The true originator being Moss. They were there in the very beginning and making those really cool, unique snow surf designs. Hands down, Moss all the way. I have never ridden, I've ridden like once, just a quick test of a Moss board. I've never owned one, I've never ridden one. I kind of feel bad about that. I would like to have something in my collection, but there's so many boards to ride and there's just not enough time. So I can't speak personally to the Moss experience, but I've ridden a lot of the Field Earth boards, a lot of the Genten boards. I have a lot of them in my collection. And, really that's the key, is they made those boards to work on the mountains and the conditions we have here. So let's circle back. I think the key answer to the question I received is that the Flyfisk is quite a stiff board. I have it as a split board. And even as a split board, that means it's cut down the middle. It's two narrow boards that you stick together. The torsion should be really soft. And the torsion is soft. That's the twisting, right? But the flex, this one is really stiff even as a split board. So I've ridden it quite a few times, but I have 2 or 3 split boards that I choose from, depending on the condition and the mountain I'm riding on. The best experience I had with the Flyfisk split board was last year at Kiroro on an incredibly deep day. And we hiked up quite a long slope with a really good pitch, and the snow was it was super deep, but it was a little, I don't want to say firm, but there was like a nice sponge cake, so that when you pushed on it, it kind of pushed you back. There's that kind of snow where you push on it, you press down on it, and it just goes down. And that's when you're like submarining. But when you push down on a turn and it kind of punches you back out so you can go into the next turn, that's great powder. That's a fantastic experience. And it was perfect for the Flyfisk because that stiffness allowed me to really push on those turns, and it really pushed me back. And I was able to get great speed while doing like mega turns. And that felt great. On other days when I rode it, when I first bought it, of course you get a new board, you want to ride it right away. I took it out and I was like, ooh, this is not exactly what I was expecting. I wrote it on, first I wrote it on the course, of course, just to test it out. And it felt stiff underfoot. I was like, ooh, this board's like really stiff. I'm gonna have to like pull this one out on special occasions, especially when you have like a heavy backpack. Great. So if it's just kind of like a thin layer of powder or kind of like just noodling down a slope with tight trees, I take my Field Earth S1, which is a softer split board, and that is much more forgiving. But if it's wide open, steeper slope, deep pow, heavy backpack, fly fisk is the way to go. Now, how do we remedy this situation? Maybe you only have one board. Maybe you can't go out and buy like 20 boards because they're so expensive. I totally understand that. If you only have one board and it's the fly fisk and you have to ride it in all kinds of terrain and all kinds of snow, you might think about a couple things. First is your stance position. It might be worthwhile to experiment where you set the bindings front and back. The width of your stance also could be looked at. I have slowly been narrowing my stance a little bit. All the guys around me have narrowed their stances over the years a lot, and it takes a little while to get used to. I still like that rather wide stance, but the narrower it is, the sweeter the spot you're in. You can apply more force to the center of the board and thereby flexing it better. The wider you are, the more you're like pushing the board down flat and not allowing it to flex, if that makes sense, right? You're wider on the board. If you want to narrow up your stance a little bit, you've got more nose and more tail to work with and you can flex it better. That is one thing. You also might want to think about, with those wider powder boards, I generally like to ride front foot as far forward as possible so that you can bring the tail up. The more you can bring the tail up, the more speed you're going to get. And, you know, set front is like the new set back. Back in the day, we had to set our bindings back to keep the nose up. But you may actually have to go back to that style if it's that kind of snow and you're in that kind of terrain. You might think about setting your bindings back, making that tail shorter, and that'll allow that nose to come up. And you can kind of do this kind of snowboarding where you're kind of swishing the nose around, riding on the tail, rather than being more centered or set front where you're really on top of the nose and you're really carving, which is, you know, I think the best way. But if the conditions don't allow that, why not set your bindings back? I think those are the keys. I also recommend everybody to really get into tuning your board as best as possible with the wax and the edges, beveling the edges, especially we used to just say detuning. If the edges are too sharp up towards the nose, that can really affect the way the board digs into the snow. You want that kind of rounded, soft edges up at the nose and a little bit on the tail as well. We could go like at least an hour, 2 hours talking about that stuff. I won't go into all the details, but it's definitely worth researching that as another step. The key though is be willing to change your stance on the board day by day, depending on what you're feeling and what the mountain is giving you. And just think about that stiffness of the board, slope, and type of snow you're riding on. I hope that answers some questions. It probably leads to even more. If you have any questions, please send them, leave a comment with your question. I love that stuff. It's great. I'll try to get to it. It makes me think about things and try to understand my experiences and what I've learned from 35 years of snowboarding. It's fascinating stuff. Okay, everybody, drive safe.
If you like to drive around and talk about the latest happenings, this is the channel you need. So subscribe and follow Carmentary.